You're taking life far too seriously. Your ego thinks every problem is life or death. Every setback is catastrophic. Every decision is crucial. Every mistake is permanent. You're treating your existence like a high-stakes performance where one wrong move means failure, and the weight of that seriousness is crushing you. Carl Jung would say, your seriousness isn't wisdom, it's a defense mechanism, and it's preventing the very psychological development you think you're being serious about achieving. Jung discovered that people who take life most seriously are often those least capable of real psychological growth, not because growth isn't important, but because excessive seriousness is the ego's way of maintaining control, avoiding spontaneity, and preventing the play that individuation requires. The rigidity you think is responsibility is actually fear masquerading as maturity. I'm about to explain why Jung believed that taking life too seriously is one of the most common ways people prevent their own individuation, why your seriousness is blocking your growth, why the ego loves seriousness and the self requires play, and why learning to take life less seriously might be the most serious psychological work you can do. If you're suffocating under the weight of your own seriousness, Jung would say, you're not being mature, you're being defended. And those defenses are costing you your aliveness. Here's what Jung understood about seriousness. It's not the same as earnestness. Being earnest means you care deeply about what matters. Being serious means you treat everything as if it matters equally and absolutely. Earnestness is flexible and alive. Seriousness is rigid and defended. The ego loves seriousness because seriousness maintains control. When you're serious, you're not spontaneous. When you're serious, you're not playful. When you're serious, you're not vulnerable. Seriousness keeps everything predictable, measured, controlled. It's the ego's way of pretending it's in charge of a life that's fundamentally unpredictable. But, Jung discovered, individuation requires the opposite of seriousness. It requires play, spontaneity, humor, and the willingness to look foolish. It requires the trickster energy that the overly serious ego has banished. It requires lightness about your own importance and flexibility about your own identity. Think about how you relate to your life. How seriously do you take your problems, your image, your opinions, your plans, your identity? If you're like most people, you treat all of these with a heaviness that Jung would call pathological. You've made your life into something so serious that you've forgotten it's also something to be played with, experimented with, enjoyed. Jung spent time at bowling and playing, literally, building with stones, carving wood, creating art. Not because these activities were important, but because they weren't. He was deliberately engaging in purposeless play to counterbalance the seriousness of his psychological work. He understood the psyche needs non-seriousness to stay healthy. Without it, you become rigid, defended, and unable to access the depths that individuation requires. If you're taking life too seriously, Jung would say, you're not being wise, you're being defended. And those defenses are preventing the very growth you think your seriousness is protecting. Jung's first insight about seriousness. It's not maturity, it's defense. The ego uses seriousness to maintain control and keep the unconscious at bay. And that defense, while feeling responsible, actually prevents psychological growth. Here's the mechanism. Your unconscious is spontaneous, unpredictable, creative, and chaotic. It doesn't follow your plans or respect your control. The ego, threatened by this unpredictability, develops seriousness as a way to rigidify life. If everything is serious, everything must be controlled, measured, and planned. Nothing spontaneous can break through. Nothing playful can emerge. The unconscious is kept safely locked away. But Jung discovered you can't individuate without accessing your unconscious, and you can't access your unconscious when you're being too serious. Seriousness creates psychological rigidity that prevents the fluid movement between conscious and unconscious that transformation requires. Think about when you've been most serious, when you're desperately trying to control an outcome, when you're terrified of making a mistake, when you're performing a role you're afraid to fail at. In those moments, you're completely identified with your ego's agenda. You're so serious about maintaining control that you've lost access to spontaneity, creativity, and the unconscious material that could actually help you. The unconscious speaks through spontaneity, through slips of the tongue, through play, through humor, through moments when your control relaxes and something genuine emerges. But if you're always serious, always controlled, always defended, those moments never happen. You've locked yourself in your ego and thrown away the key. Jung noticed this, especially in his most defended patients. They'd come to analysis incredibly serious about their psychological work. They'd talk about their problems with grave intensity, analyze their dreams with scholarly precision, and approach their inner work like it was a doctoral dissertation. And they'd make no progress, because their seriousness was preventing the very thing that could heal them: contact with their unconscious. He'd sometimes have to shock them out of their seriousness, tell a joke during a heavy session, point out the absurdity of their situation, encourage them to play with their problems rather than treat them so gravely. And only when their seriousness relaxed could real psychological movement begin. This is why Jung emphasized, the self has a trickster quality that the serious ego hates. The self doesn't respect your control. It doesn't honor your plans. It will undermine your seriousness at every opportunity because your seriousness is blocking access to wholeness. When you take yourself too seriously, you're essentially declaring war on your own unconscious. And that war is unwinnable. But the defense mechanism of seriousness creates more than just rigidity. It generates a specific kind of psychological suffering that most people don't recognize as self-created. Jung's second insight: seriousness doesn't just defend, it amplifies. When you take everything seriously, you make every experience heavier, more burdensome, more overwhelming than it actually is. You're not seeing reality clearly. You're seeing reality through the distorting lens of excessive seriousness. Here's what actually happens. Life contains both light and heavy experiences. Some things genuinely matter, some things don't. But when you take life too seriously, you collapse this distinction. Everything becomes heavy. Every decision feels momentous. Every problem feels catastrophic. Every interaction feels high stakes. You're living in constant psychological weight because your seriousness is amplifying the gravity of everything. Jung observed this pattern constantly. Patients would describe problems that, while real, they'd made unbearable through their seriousness about them. A work conflict became existential crisis. A relationship difficulty became proof of their fundamental unworthiness. A minor failure became evidence of permanent inadequacy. The actual situation was challenging. Their seriousness about it made it crushing. But here's what Jung understood. The weight you're feeling isn't the weight of your problems. It's the weight of your seriousness about your problems. You're not struggling under the burden of life. You're struggling under the burden of how seriously you're taking life. Think about your own experience. How often do you look back at something you treated with absolute seriousness and realize it wasn't that serious? The decision you agonized over turned out fine either way. The mistake you thought was catastrophic became irrelevant. The problem you treated as life or death resolved itself or became meaningless. Your seriousness created suffering that the situation itself didn't require. This is the trap of excessive seriousness. It prevents perspective. When you're too serious, you can't see that most of what you're treating as crucial is actually temporary. You can't recognize that your current problems will be forgotten or irrelevant in 5 years. You can't access the part of you that knows this too shall pass. Jung emphasized, psychological health requires the ability to zoom out, to see your problems from a distance, to recognize their temporary nature, to hold them lightly rather than gripping them intensely. But seriousness prevents this zooming out. It keeps you identified with the immediate drama, unable to see that the drama is just one small chapter in a much longer story. The seriously depressed person can't see that their depression, while real, is temporary. The seriously anxious person can't recognize that most of what they're anxious about will never happen. The seriously offended person can't perceive that the offense is too small to carry forever. Their seriousness locks them into a perspective that makes everything feel more permanent, more important, more overwhelming than it actually is. But Jung discovered the antidote, humor. Not superficial humor that denies problems, but deep humor that puts problems in perspective. When you can laugh at your situation, not dismissively but compassionately, you've accessed a viewpoint beyond the ego's seriousness. You've stepped back enough to see, this is challenging, but it's not the end. This matters, but it's not everything. This is difficult, but it's also somewhat absurd. That capacity for lightness, for perspective, for recognizing the simultaneous tragedy and comedy of existence, that's psychological maturity. Not the heavy seriousness most people mistake for it. And without that lightness, every weight becomes unbearable because you're carrying it without the psychological shock absorbers that humor and play provide. But the heaviness seriousness creates isn't just about problems. It extends to something even more fundamental about how you experience your entire identity. Jung's third insight cuts to the core of why seriousness suffocates. When you take your roles too seriously, you become identified with them. You stop being a person playing a role and start believing you are the role. And that identification prevents the fluidity that individuation requires. Here's the psychological trap. Life requires roles. You're a professional, a parent, a partner, a friend. These roles are necessary for functioning in society, but Jung discovered, problems arise when you take these roles so seriously that you lose the distance between your essential self and the role you're performing. When you're too serious about being the successful professional, you can't afford to fail at work without experiencing existential crisis. When you're too serious about being the good parent, you can't make mistakes without shame spiraling. When you're too serious about being the spiritual person, you can't acknowledge your shadow without feeling like a fraud. Your seriousness has collapsed the distance between your role and yourself. But Jung emphasized, you are not your roles. You're the awareness inhabiting different roles at different times. When you take your roles too seriously, you forget this. You become the role. And becoming the role means you've imprisoned yourself in a performance you can never stop. Think about how exhausting this is. When you're too serious about your role, you can never drop the performance. The professional can't be vulnerable because it threatens their serious professional identity. The parent can't admit they don't know what they're doing because it threatens their serious parent identity. The spiritual person can't acknowledge their anger because it threatens their serious spiritual identity. You're performing constantly, defending constantly, maintaining constantly. Because if you drop the seriousness about your role even for a moment, you risk the terror of not knowing who you are beneath the role. Your seriousness is protecting you from that void, but it's also preventing you from discovering that the void isn't empty. It contains your actual self. Jung would sometimes encourage patients to deliberately play with their roles, to perform them consciously as roles rather than taking them as identity. The serious executive learning to speak about themselves in third person. The executive is very concerned about this project. The serious parent catching themselves in the performance. I'm playing the responsible parent role very intensely right now. This creates distance, and distance creates freedom. Because here's what Jung understood. When you can see your roles as roles, you can move between them fluidly. You can be the professional at work, then drop it completely at home. You can be the parent when needed, then be just yourself when the role isn't required. You're not trapped in any single performance because you're not taking any of them so seriously that you've become identified with them. This flexibility is psychological health, but it's impossible when you're taking your roles too seriously. Your seriousness has made your roles into prisons. You can't drop them even when they're not needed, because dropping them feels like dissolving yourself. But roles aren't the only thing that excessive seriousness rigidifies. There's something even more fundamental that seriousness destroys. If you're recognizing this, that your seriousness is actually ego defense, that it's making everything feel heavier than it is, that you've become trapped in roles you're taking too seriously, Jung would say you're ready to discover the lightness that real psychological maturity requires. Before we explore why play is essential for individuation and how seriousness blocks your authentic self, check out our new guide, True Self Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self Discovery. Let's continue, because these next insights reveal why you can't individuate without play, and why your seriousness about being authentic is preventing you from being authentic. Jung's fourth insight reveals something that serious people hate hearing. You cannot individuate without play. Not play as distraction or escape, but play as a psychological necessity. The serious approach to life prevents the very creativity, spontaneity, and experimentation that transformation requires. Here's what Jung discovered at Bollingen. When he stopped being serious and allowed himself to play, building stone structures, carving wood, creating art with no purpose, he accessed parts of his psyche that analysis and serious psychological work couldn't reach. Play wasn't a break from his development, it was the development. Play allows the psyche to move freely without the ego's agenda dictating outcomes. When you're playing, you're not trying to achieve anything, prove anything, or become anything. You're simply engaging with whatever emerges. And that engagement without agenda is how the unconscious reveals itself. But serious people struggle profoundly with purposeless play. They need every activity to have meaning, produce results, or serve development. They can't just play for play's sake, because their ego demands that everything serve some serious purpose. And that demand prevents the very psychological movement that play facilitates. Think about when you last truly played. Not exercise for health, not pursued a hobby for accomplishment, not engaged in leisure that was really just rest so you could be productive later, but actually played with no purpose whatsoever. For most serious adults, it's been years, maybe decades, and that absence of play isn't just sad, it's psychologically damaging. Jung understood. Play accesses the child archetype, which contains spontaneity, creativity, and the capacity for wonder that the serious adult ego has lost. Without regular contact with this archetype, you become rigid, predictable, and unable to respond creatively to life's unpredictability. You're trying to control everything because you've lost the capacity to dance with anything. This is why Jung built with stones at Bollingen, not to create something meaningful, but to engage in purposeless activity that let his unconscious move freely. He was playing, and in that play, insights would emerge that no amount of serious thinking could produce. Solutions would appear that analysis couldn't find. The psyche would reveal itself in ways that only happened when he stopped trying to make it happen seriously. But here's the resistance most serious people feel. Play seems irresponsible. How can you play when there are problems to solve, work to do, development to achieve? Jung would say, because without play, you'll approach your problems, work, and development with the same rigid seriousness that created them. Play doesn't prevent serious work. It makes serious work actually effective by preventing the rigidity that blocks creativity. The most psychologically healthy people Jung encountered had maintained their capacity for play despite adult responsibilities. They could be serious when needed, then drop the seriousness completely and engage in purposeless creativity, spontaneous adventure, or absurd humor. They hadn't maintained this capacity by being irresponsible. They'd maintained it because they understood. Psychological flexibility requires regular contact with non-serious engagement. This isn't about being childish. It's about staying childlike, maintaining the spontaneity, creativity, and playfulness that the child naturally has, but the serious adult has systematically destroyed in themselves in the name of maturity. And this brings us to Jung's most radical insight about seriousness, one that reveals why your very seriousness about being authentic is preventing you from being authentic. Jung's final insight is perhaps the most paradoxical. The more seriously you take your quest for authenticity, the more inauthentic you become. Because seriousness about authenticity is still the ego, controlling, performing, and defending, just in a more sophisticated way. Here's the mechanism. You become serious about being your authentic self. You analyze your true nature. You work on expressing your real feelings. You try to identify your genuine desires. You attempt to live from your truth. All of this is ego activity, the ego trying to produce authenticity. And authenticity cannot be produced by the ego. It can only emerge when the ego stops trying. Jung noticed this, especially with people on spiritual or psychological paths. They'd become incredibly serious about their authenticity. They'd constantly monitor whether they were being real or fake. They'd analyze every interaction to determine if they were expressing their true self. They'd become paralyzed by the seriousness of their quest for authenticity. And in all that serious striving, they'd become profoundly inauthentic. Because authentic self-expression is spontaneous, not calculated. It's natural, not produced. It happens when you stop being serious about being authentic and just are. But that simple being is impossible when you're seriously trying to achieve it. This is the paradox of self-conscious authenticity. The moment you become serious about being authentic, you've created a performance of authenticity. You're not being real. You're being serious about appearing real, which is just a more sophisticated falseness. Think about when you're most genuinely yourself. It's not when you're trying to be authentic. It's when you've forgotten to try, when you're laughing spontaneously, creating playfully, engaging without agenda. In those moments, your authentic self emerges naturally, because your serious ego has temporarily relaxed its control. But the person who's very serious about authenticity rarely has these moments. They're too busy monitoring their authenticity to be authentic. They're too focused on expressing their true self to let their true self simply be. Their seriousness has become another prison, just with authentic written on the walls. Jung's solution isn't to stop caring about authenticity. It's to stop being serious about it. To approach your authentic self with lightness, humor, playfulness. To recognize that you're not going to achieve authenticity through serious effort. You're going to discover it by relaxing the serious effort and allowing what's natural to emerge. This requires a fundamental shift from doing to being, from striving to allowing, from controlling to surrendering. And all of these shifts are impossible while you're taking yourself too seriously. Your seriousness keeps you in doing mode, in striving mode, in controlling mode, which prevents the being, allowing, and surrendering that authenticity requires. The irony is profound. You want to be authentic, so you take authenticity seriously. But your seriousness about authenticity is precisely what's preventing authenticity. It's the ego's final trap, making you serious about the very thing that requires you to stop being serious. Jung would say, want to be more authentic? Take yourself less seriously. Play more. Laugh at yourself more. Stop monitoring whether you're being real, and just engage with life without that constant self-consciousness. Your authentic self will emerge naturally when you're not seriously trying to produce it. Let me bring these insights together. Your seriousness is the ego's defense mechanism, not psychological maturity. It keeps the unconscious locked away. Taking life seriously makes everything feel heavier than it actually is. The weight you feel is the weight of your seriousness, not your problems. You are not your roles, and taking them too seriously traps you in performances you can't escape. Play is psychologically essential, not optional. You cannot individuate without the spontaneity and creativity that purposeless play provides. And your seriousness about being authentic is creating inauthenticity. Real authenticity emerges when you stop trying so seriously to achieve it. Jung would say, if you're suffocating under excessive seriousness, you're not being responsible or mature. You're being defended and rigid. Real psychological health requires flexibility, the ability to be serious when needed, and then completely drop seriousness when it's not. The capacity to zoom out, laugh, play, and hold your problems lightly even while addressing them earnestly. This doesn't mean nothing matters. It means not everything matters equally. It means treating what's genuinely important with earnestness while approaching yourself, your roles, and your quest for authenticity with the lightness that prevents rigidity. The psyche needs both, depth and lightness, seriousness and play, striving and allowing. But most people lean too far into seriousness because that's what the ego prefers. It feels controlled, it feels safe, it feels mature. But Jung would say, it's just defended, and those defenses are preventing the aliveness, spontaneity, and authentic self-expression that make life worth living. If you're taking life too seriously, if every problem feels crushing, every role feels imprisoning, every quest for authenticity feels like another burden, Jung would tell you, your seriousness isn't helping, it's hurting. You're not being mature, you're being rigid. And that rigidity is preventing the very psychological development you think your seriousness is protecting. Start with one practice. Notice when you're being serious. Feel the heaviness, the control, the rigidity in your body. Then ask, what if I took this 10% less seriously? What if I held this lightly instead of gripping it intensely? You don't have to stop caring. You just have to stop treating everything like life or death. Give yourself permission to play. Not productive play, not purposeful play, genuinely pointless play. Create something for no reason. Be silly for no purpose. Laugh at yourself and your problems. Not dismissively, but affectionately. See if you can find the absurdity in your own drama while still addressing what needs addressing. Take your roles less seriously. Remember, you're not your profession, your parenthood, your partnership. You're the awareness inhabiting these roles temporarily. You can perform them well without becoming identified with them. You can drop them when they're not needed instead of carrying them 24/7. And please, stop being so serious about being authentic. Your authentic self doesn't need to be produced through earnest effort. It needs to be allowed through playful surrender. Stop monitoring whether you're real and just be. Your authenticity is waiting beneath your seriousness about finding it. Life is both meaningful and absurd. Hold both. Take what matters seriously. Laugh at what doesn't. And for God's sake, remember to play. Because Jung was right. You can't become whole while being completely serious. The self has a trickster quality that requires you to lighten up, loosen your grip, and stop taking yourself so damn seriously. If you're ready to release the excessive seriousness that's suffocating your aliveness, subscribe to this channel. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.